Ladies and gentlemen, hello. My name is Sarah Pollack, which in fairness, I'm telling you for like the 50th time now, but welcome to another episode of Pioneers Talks. This time, my beloved guinea pig on the other end, and I say guinea pig in both a loving sense, but also because he genuinely is a guinea pig. Today, we're doing the first remote Pioneers Talks all the way from Estonia, which is showing the beauty of technology, how we can be connected in this cloud civilization of ours, is no one else but Florian Marcus, who not only is, I dare say, a dear friend, but is also a Family Guy enthusiast, someone who has been responsible and really at the heart of the phenomenal successes that Estonia has had with its e-government, is now in the private sector, so he's got experiences from both sides of the barricade. He's a TEDx speaker, and there's plenty more superlatives that I could say, but I best just introduce him. Florian, hello.
Lovely to see you again, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
Lovely to see you, Florian. We saw each other back in, like a couple of weeks ago in Estonia at a conference, which was awesome. And I actually realized that we met without us realizing like 3 years prior at a conference here in Prague where you were, I think, remote as well. And we're talking about the digitalization of the healthcare sector, which is always fun. You were doing something else then, you're doing something else now. So why don't you tell us what you do?
You have an outstanding memory. I mean, you are the one who remembered that we had met 3 years prior, and I was like, oh yeah, sure we did. Yeah, absolutely. But no. So I guess the core word of today is, or two words are digital transformation. And I sort of got into that sphere almost by accident. I did a double master's in political science and economics at UCL and the University of Tartu in South Estonia. And when I first moved to Estonia, I immediately realized how digital the whole thing is. The first apartment that I rented happened with the digital signature, with a Word document as a contract. And for me as a person, number one, as a German, but then also having lived in the UK before, I was very used to paper bureaucracy. I'm sure you can relate to that, both from the Czech Republic and having lived in the UK for a couple of years as well. So that was the normality for me. And then moving to Estonia and coming in touch with this digital society was mind-blowing to me. And then you do what people like you and I do. For myself as a political scientist, you just wonder, how the hell does this work here? And effectively nowhere else, nowhere else as well, at least. And that's what brought me into working in that sector after I graduated. So I first worked for the Estonian government when Estonia had the presidency of the Council of the European Union in 2017. Started explaining digitalization to people abroad. Then worked in the cybersecurity space for a year. Then moved back to the public sector. For 3 years, that's where I had the chance to sort of explain digital transformation to the highest kinds of stakeholders around the world, and help them effect changes in their respective countries. And now I'm back in the private sector with Proud Engineers as a project manager, where we sort of help other countries digitalize their services, their mindset, their societies. So it's all come from that first interaction of, Jesus, this is good. Why doesn't anyone else have this? And we're still here. So yeah, really cool.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. And one of the reasons I think that I love talking to you in general and picking your brain is that you really do bridge that kind of interdisciplinarity of the kind of society and the way that society is evolving, but also the technological pressures on society and how various processes which we kind of think are historically given can actually be either hugely accelerated, innovated, gotten rid of with the help of digitalization. So I'll probe more into the other countries and like the anthropology of innovation as well in a little bit. But going back to your time in the e-government, on your LinkedIn, you have a fascinating quote, which I love, that digitalization is life and digitalization is love, which is awesome. But what I cannot get my head around is why the e-government in Estonia is such a big deal in the first place, like what the history of that is, because like the history of the Baltic states is a troubled one from the historical and economic perspective. The yoke of the Soviet Union was kind of like remorseless in that regard. And we don't. Estonia's kind of emerged as this diamond from the rough in regards to technology, and as you mentioned, you've got countries from all over the world looking to you for inspiration. So, how did this come about?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, that's a very good question, and Estonia really understood from the very start that it had a couple of pain points that needed addressing. There's a lovely page called estonia.com where you can check out the different aspects of Estonian digital history. But Estonia understood, number one, it doesn't have a lot of money. Number two, it doesn't have a lot of people. Number three, it faces challenges with corruption. And at number four, it has challenges with a low population density. And so the result was, the understanding was, it really doesn't make sense for us to build up a paper bureaucracy. I mean, of course, there are some remnants from the Soviet Union. There's a misunderstanding, a misconception that Estonia started from a sort of greenfield approach. That is not true with regards to IT. But certainly there was a lot of work to be done in that area. And then Estonia started going digital, in the mid-1990s, I would say. That's when the first legal changes were effected. The first digital service was offered in 1999. That was the online tax declaration. In 2001, the government made the electronic identity compulsory, having learned from Finland that spent millions of their currency on electronic identity cards, but didn't make it compulsory for the people. As a result, they spent a lot of money on service development and so on, but even to this day, only a minority of the population actually uses those services with the government-provided electronic identity.
Oh, wow. Okay, so in that case, like that's, I think, a really important thing with the technology as well, like the human aspect of just learning from your mistakes and from the mistakes of others. Yeah. Yeah,
and I think there's a big misunderstanding as well that Estonia was the sort of the prime trailblazer that just came up with, created the internet, created the first electronic idea, and it's just not true. It was very carefully looking at the success stories and mistakes of neighbors. Of course, I mean, Finland has a very special place in Estonian cultural consciousness because of the linguistic and cultural connectedness. But certainly Estonia looked at other countries and what they did well and what they didn't do well. And now is the chance for other countries to do the same with the example of Estonia, because we didn't do everything right for the last 30 years either.
Yeah, and this is, I think, really important that when we bring in the guests into this, the esteemed guests into this video cast, one of the things is like having the innovation as such, but the other one is kind of breaking down the psychological barriers between actually implementing the technology. And like there's absolutely like no reason or like no way for the technology to be kind of effective and actually successful if the psychological barriers aren't broken down. And actually on that front, I remember we discussed with in regards to healthcare all those years ago when you were very kindly kind of sharing your experiences here with us in the Czech Republic. What are like the concrete products of the digitalization or like of the kind of use cases gone well in the Estonian digital history? I know that healthcare has been a big deal for you guys, as well as the kind of e-identity. The fact that you guys fill in your taxes like within a matter of like tens of seconds online is still a highly depressing comparison for me. But if you had to pinpoint, even from your experience, like some of the highlights or milestones, what would those be?
I'll have to mention right now that 2 days ago I did my income tax declaration. Took me a minute and a half, I would say. I reminded my wife, and she was like, "Oh yeah, I'll just do it on my phone. I don't have my laptop in front of me right now." She did it in 2 minutes as well, so it's pretty good. What about the key points of e-governance? I would say the core for every country would have to be electronic IDs. Making them compulsory, making it normal for people to expect digital services as well. Because I think right now most countries are still on a stage where if you want to get something done, your first thought is, oh, what are the opening hours of government agency XYZ? And just to get away from that kind of service thinking. After that, the digital signature as well. So just saying a paper signature is now legally equivalent to the digital signature. Government agencies must accept your digitally signed documents. It's not a question of, do you feel like it today or not? It's a must. And beyond that, I would say it depends on the people's culture. It may very well be different for different countries around the world. In Estonia, as you said, sort of the e-health system that was introduced in 2008 was one of the main drivers for widespread use, because we're all human, and we all need to go to the doctor every now and then, even if it's just for a regular checkup. And so I think that was one of the main drivers in Estonia. Voting happened in 2005, and that was sort of one of the more crazy pie in the sky ideas. And you know, in my old job, I was often asked, why did Estonia do online voting? And the answer, the true answer, is that the politicians stood in a room and they said, what would be really crazy to bring online? You know, what wouldn't we even think about? And online voting was the choice, because it had never succeeded anywhere else, not even remotely. It was tried and then shelved in different countries. And so that's one area where Estonia really showed through in 2005. And we've got parliamentary elections next month, early next month. And yeah, so people are getting their laptops ready to vote online as well. And then I suppose something that is really important is the underlying points that generate trust. This is not a service per se.
Yes.
I'm sure we're going to talk about trust later on as well, but I wanted to mention it right now because it's an underpinning feature of a trustworthy digital service environment. In Estonia, we have something called the data tracker, where we can see almost every single time, you know, when a government authority, when an agency looks at my data, what part of the data they look at, when and why. And so this gives me a pretty good idea of how my data is being treated. And I think this sort of calms down the concerns of a big brother state. There are many other guidelines and technological idiosyncrasies that would prevent the tax officer from looking at my health data or something like that. But yeah, that's one of the core points, I would say.
Yeah, Florian, you mentioned a great buzzword, and I'm so glad that you mentioned it, blockchain, in regards to security and the data of the Estonian citizens, especially in sensitive cases like healthcare. I think the de-buzzwordization is one of the things that we want to achieve with this vidcast, because people always see a new innovation, they get scared of it, and it takes a while to break down those barriers for it to actually like get implemented and understood in terms of what it actually really is. It's like with AI, well, it's glorified statistics, but it's going to take a few years before people start seeing it as Terminator. So let's take blockchain. Like, how would you, because Estonia is using it to a certain degree. It's one of those things that does build trust, is like this independent kind of checker on the side, as you beautifully mentioned. So how would you put that like brand new innovation into the context of your digitalization efforts?
Well, you mentioned the people that are skeptical of innovation, and of course, those people are going to slow you down. What can be at least equally challenging are people who are overly enthusiastic about something and would say next thing has to include X, Y, Z, whether it's blockchain, AI, or cloud computing or anything else.
Yeah.
What I've seen, at least working now in the private sector, those people are equally challenging. In Estonia, blockchain is used just in a couple of different registries to ensure data continuity, to make sure that we see how data is being changed and that it is secured. But in what we've seen now in tenders around the world is that government agencies insist that the next solution must include blockchain, and that's a big head stretcher for us, because very rarely is there an application where blockchain is the only solution or the best game in town. It's extremely expensive to set up, because usually you want something personalized. And the most critical point usually is that you have to distinguish between public and private blockchains, so public or permissioned blockchains. And both for legal reasons, and if you would ask the question to a politician, do you want a private or a public blockchain where everybody can contribute a block, or where it's just your government service that can contribute? Of course, they will choose a private blockchain run by government servers. At which point you have to ask, does this make anything better? Like, how does a private blockchain make anything better than a very well secured regular database, decentralized network? So I think this is a challenge that we're still facing in countries around the world, as sort of getting the understanding of what the technology actually is capable of and what it's just not capable of.
Yeah, and you mentioned a great thing in the sense that just like going after the buzzwords and making sure they're involved somehow. I was discussing this with like the previous guests on this vidcast that so many times I've been in talks with innovation managers and they say, oh, we want AI, and you ask them why, and they say, well, because everyone else is doing it. Like that's the worst possible motivation you can have for anything.
Good, yeah.
But you mentioned other countries, and behind you on your right or on your left, you've got the award from Ho Chi Minh City, from the local university. And I know that you've been kind of traveling over the world. You've had delegations coming on a weekly basis to Estonia to learn from you. But how is then the anthropological, the cultural kind of transition of these innovations? Like, is it often just like a mindless copy paste, or is there some kind of personalization involved? How do these kind of like learning projects even take place?
I think there are a lot of attempts at copy paste, not necessarily because they're mindless, but just because it worked in Estonia. So surely the same cookie cutter solution must work in country XYZ. Those people are usually easier to convince that yes, of course, like take the technology, take the learnings, but let's try to adapt it to the local situation. So I think those are the easier candidates. The more tricky delegations and people to work with are those, for me at least, that have very strong cultural preconceptions of what digitalization is. My go-to references would be the Japanese and the Germans, who are both very big industrial manufacturing nations, engineering nations. If you want something done to perfection, it will have taken 20 years to get to that point. But if you want something done to perfection, you go to the Japanese and the Germans. If you want the best cars, you know where to go. If you want the best kind of technology, you know where to go. But it also means that especially those cultures have a very, very strong expectation that there is something physical. There's a physical aspect to digitalization. Yeah. That especially from Japan, that there is a robot welcoming you at the entrance of the hospital, where you type in your name and then it goes off and brings the tablet somewhere or something. And it's just, and that's just not how digitalization, I'm not going to say that not how it works, but how it's supposed to work. The whole shtick of digitalization is make things as seamless, invisible, proactive as possible, so that things happen for me as a citizen, either with just a minimum amount of interactions, or completely automatically without me even being fully aware that it's happening. And with those countries, it's a bit tricky to sort of really dig into that mindset and get that expectation out. And the other challenge, I suppose, with some countries, those that are too rich. And those are both, old democracies, but also Middle Eastern countries and so on, where they don't have the pain. I mentioned at the start that Estonia had that very clear pain, and this is how we're trying to solve it. But in countries like Germany, if your bureaucracy is really slow and inefficient, that's fine. It's always been that way. You can just throw 1,000 more government officials at a problem. You can throw a couple of millions at a problem, and it's probably going to work out. And if it doesn't, at least you try. The same with Gulf countries where there's a lot of money. And that's great. You need money to innovate, but also it sort of becomes a small shopping spree where you just want to mix and match the nicest solutions from everywhere, without looking at the local context so much. So this is what I've seen in some countries as well, and you have to be aware of that when you try to innovate and transform a whole country, I would say.
Yes, the kind of hacker man mentality that often arises from a crisis. And like looking back at history, like it's no wonder, we had Ian Standen here as a guest who spoke about the deciphering of the Enigma during the Second World War. When you have thousands of people dying at the
episode, by the way.
Oh, thank you. See, we've got a reference. It's all good. You should go watch it. But when you've got tens of thousands of soldiers dying on both sides of the front all day, every day, like then you need to crack the code as soon as possible. impossible because like there's no alternative. You don't have the luxury of time, the luxury of money, the luxury of resources. And this kind of like hacking mentality is something that is so wonderful in Estonia, but at the same time, it's not something that, especially like in my neck of the woods, you'd expect of a state institution to do. Like very traditionally, like when there was, the crisis of either COVID, the COVID pandemic and the digitalization kind of associated with that, or even the crisis in the Ukraine, immediately kind of like the eye of Sauron goes towards the private sphere because things are more efficient, they're quicker, the processes are clearer, and people kind of have an expectation of a higher standard. If the state is going to do it, it's going to be half-baked and on technologies from like the 1990s. How does that, because you've seen both sides of the barricade, as I mentioned, with both the public and private sector, how does that work in Estonia? Because from conversations with you, I'm like amazed to learn that actually it's not like the mutual demonization of these kind of two halves of the market. Quite the opposite. There's a very active cooperation and conversation going on. You've got tech giants like Skype that emerged in your neck of the woods. So how do you see the kind of public-private partnerships and the effects it has on digitalization and the trust that people have in those services?
It's a very good question. So I feel like in general, of course, the public sector will always lag behind the private sector. That's just the nature of the game, So I would say even in Estonia, probably the public sector is 10 years behind the private sector. And I think that's fine because we will always have to legislate our way through innovation, whereas the private sector could just say, oh, we invented the thing. Oh, it's not allowed? Well, make a law about it. How about that? It's fine for the public sector to lag behind. However, there's a very clear signal in Estonia that the public sector is open to innovation. All of these different solutions, the EID, the X-Road that enables the data exchange between government agencies and private sector entities as well, all of these things were made, of course, they were commissioned by the government, but they were created by private sector companies. And they continue to be by companies to this day, handed over to the government afterwards, of course, but certainly developed, and by the folks in the private sector. Number one, this has led to a very sort of permeable structure where it is very normal, and I think I'm a good example for that. It's very normal to move back and forth between public and private sector. Personally, I'm a big fan of the UN. Of course, it has its massive, massive flaws, but as a general, I like the idea of it. So I can imagine, working at Proud Engineers for a couple of years, going to the UN, going back to the private sector, going to the Estonian public sector again. And this is just, it's the feeling that wherever I go, I can innovate, And while, of course, salaries in the private sector are usually higher, and Estonia is no exception to that rule, you have this inspiration that you can change an entire nation's trajectory. That is something that with most companies and most positions you simply don't get to do. Unless you're the CEO of Google or Microsoft or something like that, you will not have the ability to do that. And in Estonia you do. And I think that's why many bright young people, they started a startup in their mid-20s, and then they go to the public sector and back and forth and back and forth. And I think this also reinforces the trust, not necessarily in government, but, Estonians hate their politicians just like everyone else in every other country in the world. We're still human. But there's faith in the structures, in the bureaucracy of it all, that 99% of government services are available online in Estonia. That whatever I want to get done can be done through the internet, usually within a couple of minutes. And I think that reinforced that trust as well.
Yes, yeah. I think it's the trust between the conversations happening as well, because, for example, in the Czech Republic, the kind of like public and private sector, and even the employees that go there, they're usually a different breed, and they very much kind of like adopt the persona of working in the public sector, working in the private sector to kind of like justify their life choices almost. So the fact that it's such a permeable membrane and the osmosis kind of goes both ways. Wow, I just used a biology metaphor from like year 7. Oh, no. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell.
Photosynthesis is something.
Yeah, Exactly. But it's really interesting, and I think that what that leads to as well is both transparency in the kind of like, if you have the data digitalized, I think a lot of incompetence and also, frankly, like let's face it, bribery can be hidden in traditional bureaucratic structures, and the fact that everything is online, everything's accessible, everything is secure, you suddenly have less wiggle room for the kind of like shadowy deals like in the back of the agora, going on, and I think it also leads to like one of the things that you were saying is that you have a huge adoption of these digital services, that it's not like it's the young hip people living in Tallinn that are like on there doing their digital taxes. It's seniors, it's disadvantaged groups, like demographically, that they all are using these digital services, which is great because that's true democratization of the technology as well. I have a question because I remember when we were at the conference and we were sitting in Tallinn and we were discussing how basically like you have done so much as a part of e-government, which again, for someone of your youth, is not normal in these kind of like traditional countries. What are like the personal things that you have achieved? Because there's a lot of them. And I just want to give our beloved listeners an example that, you don't have to wait 10 years to become relevant in the public sector, where you are. You can start getting hands-on and dirty straight away. So can you tell us about what you've done? I'm very excited about that.
I mean, I have to say, I don't mean to be like artificially humble or anything, but I'm, if I am even standing, then I certainly stand on the shoulder of giants, I mean, the first services were made in Estonia when I was 9 years old. So I didn't contribute to those. In fact, I didn't contribute to the implementation of a signal service in Estonia. But rather, when I moved to Estonia as a German, the flexibility and the faith in youth and low hierarchical structures, flat hierarchies, that was what enabled me to grow like that in the first place. So I'm immensely grateful to just the society here in Estonia to be able to afford those opportunities to me and others. Mm-hmm. What have I done in particular? So I think at the start, when I worked for the state chancellery, it was the sort of communication with German politicians, sort of trying to convince them of the digital single market and so on. That was one of the Estonian policies. It's still work in progress, but at least the first seeds were sown back then. Mm-hmm. I would also say that, of course, now with Proud Engineers, we've done a couple of cool projects where there's some of them are still work in progress. Years-long projects where we do shadow advisory for whole countries. Mm-hmm. I recently finished a project sponsored by the United Nations Development Program in Turkmenistan, where they looked at the electronic identity ecosystem and the data exchange system in Estonia. Mm-hmm. So I want to figure out how can we do the same thing in Estonia, in Turkmenistan. Mm-hmm. And so that's something that I led as a project manager, and it was really cool to finalize a project paper where they can sort of take it as a cheat sheet and say, okay, here are the first steps that we're going to do. These are the legal changes that we need to affect that change, and stuff like that. Right now, we have the pleasure of working in one country, the Caucasus, where they have an electronic ID, but it has to be wrapped up. Mm-hmm. They don't have a sort of systems information systems authority, and we're helping them build up that agency from scratch. And there's a lot of work to be done that's still terribly exciting, and mm-hmm. It's really rewarding because I know and many people. So I guess I'm one of the few people who have seen both sides. Having lived in a very bureaucratic, paper-based society, and then also having seen the flip side of that, and knowing that because of the work that we do as a team, that in a couple of years you can be somewhere in a village in the mountain ranges, and you can declare your taxes in 2 minutes or something, and that's super cool. You don't get the same vibe if you if you work for an oil or tobacco company. So yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioning these various countries, God, I remember when I was living in the UK and we reminisced about this. We got our checkbooks from the bank. That was unbelievable. And I also remember when I was working for a startup in America, and we were doing digitalization of the political kind of campaigning systems in Albania. That was a lot of fun, you know, just the approach towards data and towards like data collecting. And that leads me on to a question around things that are that kind of annoy me possibly the most in the world. I understand that a certain amount of them is needed, but the way that they're often discussed at the European level kind of grinds my gears, as Peter Griffin would say. And those are regulations. You know, there's a new kind of regulatory framework coming in around artificial intelligence, around blockchain, cryptocurrencies. There's the kind of like need to regulate everything through pages of PDF. How is that affecting the digitalization efforts, both in the private and public sphere in Estonia? Because I remember, for example, you mentioned the COVID app, which cost like what, 30,000 euros, because it was developed basically purely out of like an enthusiast system of people in the private sphere getting together, then handing it over to the Estonian government, and then the 30K was essentially for the regulatory framework to surround it. But how does regulation affect your work?
Very fundamentally, I would say. In some ways, you know, when the GDPR was passed, the General Data Protection Regulation, Estonia had to sort of downgrade its privacy approach to a certain extent. But you know, to harmonize it with the rest of the European legal space, the same. Well, thankfully, still different member states have a lot of autonomy in how they deal with topics like AI. Even though the most recent acts that are still being debated would give a more shared direction or shared approach. But for example, in Estonia, we've got self-driving buses on the street, you know, driving around in different parts of the city, and that was only thanks to I think it was a permission given in 2017 by the Estonian DMV, the sort of transport authority, to test those vehicles on public roads. And at the same time, you know, people are still philosophizing, oh, what if your Tesla can, you know, drive completely autonomously? Well, in Estonia, the buses already do. We have tiny parcel robots that bring you parcels or your food delivery or something.
Oh, I saw those.
They're cute.
So cute.
They're awesome.
So cute, yeah.
And if you go back to the question for a second, what have I done? I actually did the voiceover for those robots.
No way,
in two
really?
languages.
Oh.
So it's quite funny. You know, sitting in the studio and then you get the sheet and then it says like, in an angry voice, say, "Stop touching me or I'll call the police." So you know, things like that, which these robots are so likable, and I think it's easy for humans to forget the human side of technology and just to make it like an almost fear-inspiring, you know, overlord kind of robot, and to just make them a bit more cute and relatable.
So they got you. That makes all the sense. Yeah, they were like, Florian, we need to make them cute. Like, come right in.
But yeah, so regulations obviously affect Estonia and our work abroad as well. But at the same time, I would have to say, many of the standards, the GDPR, ETSI standards around electronic identity and so on, they also help build templates for other countries. So, you know, as an example, when a country that is stuck between different kinds of realms of law and culture, I'll give an example. Kazakhstan, you know, has of course some Soviet and Russian history, also quite close to China, also looks to Europe for technological inspiration. And then they say, well, we want to have a privacy framework. And then we say, well, here we have 27 countries that agree on one. How about this one? Or technological standards and so on. So that they can make sure that if in 20 years all European countries have an electronic identity that is completely interoperable with other EU member states, how about Kazakhstan's EID being compatible to that ecosystem as well? You know, that'd be awesome. And so there are so many positive sides of regulation as well. So I'm very much on the fence there, I have to say.
Yeah. And you kind of mentioned about, again, other countries and the kind of like difficulty around regulation, the complexity kind of surrounding that whole debate. We could be talking for hours, but unfortunately we're limited by time. But we'll do another kind of interview with Florian. He's just great. But I've got one last question for you, and that is how you see the future of nation states under the pressure of digitalization. Because, Estonia is amazing in the sense that like you offer a lot of the kind of digital infrastructure, even open source, so people can literally come and take aspects of your success story and embed it in their nations. I cannot help but question, and it's one of the things that we're discussing within my research group as well. Will we actually need nation states, in 20, 30 years' time? And that's not me trying to like sound like an anarchist. It's just me trying to look at social evolution and thinking, will there be some kind of like layering of different levels of structure, of different levels of responsibility? Will there be such a thing as cloud nations? Like we have that with Estonia and the e-residency. So this is more like a hypothetical blue sky thinking question for the end. But how do you see these political systems evolving? Like, maybe within our lifetimes, but even beyond?
That's a good question. I think that, already today, even within nation states, you have subdomains. You've got federal states or municipalities and so on that have a certain amount of power. But of course, if the city of Brno would say we're independent now, then the Czech national government would say, let's have a conversation about that. We have the army, sir. But I think you raise a good question, and certainly at a supranational level, we see more and more power being shifted in that direction. Number one, in a sort of structured approach, you see the European Union, you see the United Nations, where if you go to New York City, you sit in that building, you sign a paper on behalf of your government, or boom, all of a sudden you have to follow the same kind of accessibility ramp standards for people in wheelchairs. Cool, that stuff works. On a more granular level, for individuals, you mentioned e-residency, so the ability for basically any person around the world to get an electronic identity from Estonia, and not citizenship, no visa, travel rights or anything like that, but access to the digital service portfolio. And I think now there's just under 100,000 people around the world that have e-residency, which would equate it with the second biggest city in Estonia. Wow. Quite interestingly.
Yeah.
I think DAOs are also one point worth talking about, all kinds of decentralized organizations, whether it's governed by blockchain or something else. We will see more and more of that emerge. However, at the same time, systems are made to sustain themselves. So I'm sure that the nation state will fight for its survival, and especially like Estonia is actually a good example of this. Estonia has very, I'm going to say, archaic laws with regards to citizenship and immigration. You have to have lived in the country for 8 years. You have to have a B1 language certificate, and thou shalt droppeth all other citizenships that you hold.
Interesting.
So to have on a physical level, to have that stringent jus sanguinis approach to citizenship, but at the same time be the first country to allow digital citizenship, quote unquote. I think it shows how big the chasm is even within this one country, and it's going to be interesting to see how the rest of the world deals at the start, dabbles, and then starts dealing with digitalization.
Yes. Florian, you blow my mind every time. That's all right with me, man. Sorry, we met each other at the conference and we just started quoting Family Guy to each other over dinner. So it was a very networking event. Yeah. Florian, I will release you to go and get on with all the other things for the day. Thank you so much for partaking in this remote experiment. There have been some glitches, but it doesn't matter, because if there's one thing that there wasn't a glitch in, it's Florian's wit and charm and amazing experience from the digital world of not only Estonia. So thank you so much for being here with us, and I'll see you soon in Prague.
Right back at you. Thank you so much for having me, and we'll see you in Prague.
Thank you so much. Good luck with everything. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. And we'll see each other in a new episode of Pioneers Talks very soon as well. Thank you, and give us that like, subscribe, all that influencer stuff. See you soon.
Ring the bell.
Yes. Bye.
Bye. Bye.